Imagine what it is, a world in which we have to produce a GDP to sustain our economies, our population, with a third less of the workforce.
On today's show, we're with Stefano Scarpetta. He's the head of the OECD, that's the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development's Social, Economic, and Labor Affairs Bureau. The demographics are changing across Europe, the United States, the Americas, and Asia. And these are bringing some real big challenges to OECD countries.
Potentially, the implication will be massive if we do not see changes in participation to the labor market. At the same rate of productivity growth, this for the OECD average as a whole could lead to basically reducing GDP per capita growth from the current pretty meager 1% per year to actually 0.6%. So massive reduction in the ability to actually improve our living standards.
Has the OECD started to think about how states within its member countries might rethink revenue as a result of the adaptation or adoption of artificial intelligence if we're going to need fewer workers to do the jobs?
We really have to invest in
Countries across the world are looking down the barrel of an economic catastrophe, and it's being driven by demographics, lower birth rates, increased longevity, and rigid retirement systems that are getting in the way. I'm Bradley Sherman, and this is Population Next. And on today's show, we're with Stefano Scarpetta. He's the head of the OECD's, that's the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development's Social, Economic, and Labor Affairs Bureau. They have a new report out this week on the labor outlook for 2025, and it gives a lot of insights into where we're going today and what we need to do to meet the future head on. Stefano, welcome to Population Next.
Hello, how are you?
It's good to see you today. Stefano, let's begin with the big picture here. The demographics are changing across Europe, the United States, the Americas, and Asia. And these are bringing some real big challenges to OECD countries. Can you give us a big picture of what's happening around the world?
Yeah, I think most of the OECD countries, but actually way beyond the OECD countries, are actually seeing very significant demographic changes. Let me start with a positive thing. Across the world, we are living longer. If you look at just the OECD countries from the 50s to today, we have gained more than 20 years of life expectancy at birth. And even if you look at the most recent period from 2000 to today, 70% of this increase in life expectancy has been in good health. So we are living longer in good health. At the same time, however, in most of the countries, we have seen a significant decline in fertility rates. Back in the OECD, in the 50 and 60, the replacement rate, so the number of children per woman, was about 3.5. Now we are down to 1.5. So a significant decline, more than half of what it was in the 50s and 60s. Now, let me say that there are significant differences in this fertility rate. There are, apart from Israel, there are countries where they still have seen a decline, but more in the range of 1.6, 1.7 children per woman. In other countries, including some Asian countries, I can think about Korea, where actually the fertility rate is below 1, is 0.79. So a sort of trend decline in fertility rate, but significant difference across countries in the OECD, which simply point to the fact that policy do matter in order to allow, couples who would like to have children to do so, if they so wish. So these are major transformation in our economies, because this also means that for the first time ever, we are reaching a point in which the working age population, which is a big driver for economic growth, stop growing. So basically 25, 26 will be when we reach a plateau, and going forward to 2060, the working age population will decline significantly across the OECD countries. And again, human capital, labor, has been one of the key engines of economic growth, and to some extent we are going to miss that, the increase in the labor force.
Right. And your report highlights that across the OECD, we can anticipate roughly 8% drop in the working age population, but in some countries it could be over a third. Now, what does that mean in terms of economic prosperity across the OECD countries?
Well, potentially the implication will be massive, because you remember that on average across the OECD country, we're talking about a decline in the working age population by 8% by 2060. But as you pointed out, in some of the older, if you like, OECD countries, I can think about my own country, Italy, but also Japan, Korea, but also Spain, actually the decline would be much larger. In my country would be more than 35%. So imagine what it is, a world in which we have to produce a GDP to sustain our economies, our population, with a third less of the workforce. So the implication of that would be that if we do not see changes in participation to the labor market at the same rate of productivity growth, this for the OECD average as a whole could lead to basically reducing GDP per capita growth from the current pretty meager 1% per year to actually 0.6%. So 40% deceleration in the GDP per capita growth through 2060. So massive reduction in the ability to actually improve our living standards. And the decline potentially is much larger in those countries in which the working age population indeed will decline much more.
Right. That 40% is just a shocking number, one of many in a pretty impressive report. But I'm really interested in how much of this is actually locked in. Like, how much can we control of this decline in workforce participation, this decline in GDP? Or are there things that we might be able to do, some levers we can pull to make the situation maybe a bit more bright?
No, absolutely. I think, thanks God, I think we have a number of levers to actually pull and to use, provided that we have the right policies in place. I mentioned this decline by 40%. And what we did in this employment outlook publication will be launched on the 9th of July, we make some simulations, pretty bold simulation, if you like, but I think just to give a sense of the potential. And basically the main message is that there is a talent pool out there that in our economies we are not fully utilizing to their potential. Think about the fact that despite the fact that we have low unemployment rate, the youth unemployment rate is more than double the average unemployment rate. Think about the fact that despite all the effort we have made, we still see a significant gender gap in employment, let alone in the pay between men and women. And of course, as I said before, all the workers are living longer in good health, and yet after 60, the age of 60, we see a significant drop in the employment rate of all the workers. So what we did in our simulation is that let's assume that we close the gender gap in employment. Well, that's basically can reduce by half the decline in the GDP per capita growth that I mentioned before. Let's assume now that we reduce the exit of all the workers from 60 on to the level we do observe in the countries in which actually participation of all the workers is the highest, the 10% of the country with the highest participation of all the work. Another 50% of this decline in the GDP per capita growth can be actually avoided. So the message is that there are a number of tools we have in our policy set that actually by making the labor market more inclusive, by closing the gender gap, and by allowing all the workers to participate more in the labor market while creating more opportunity for young people and actually promoting regular migration. Because again, the other potential lever we can use is also to some extent create a condition whereby we can have more workers coming in aging countries. Because I remember that the mention about demographic aging is a phenomenon for the industrialized, the rich countries. We know that actually the world population will continue to increase for a number of years. And most of those young people actually are in the African continent. So basically the message is that if we were to close the gaps along all these different dimensions and promote productivity, we can certainly basically overcome the potential decline in living standard that otherwise we might be facing.
Right. And there's been quite a bit of pushback, though, across at least European nations and the United States these days against immigration. So I think I'm hearing that there needs to be some adjustment to this if we want to continue to push forward the economic prosperity that we've become so used to.
Well, migration is certainly not a silver bullet. I mean, among the different tools that I was mentioning is one that could be considered. And I mentioned regular migration. This means a proactive approach to migration, whereby we can actually listen to our employers about their needs, their workforce needs, and then organize ways in which actually migrants can come to the OECD countries already maybe with a job available for them that for which there are no workers in our countries, and provided also we give them opportunity to learn the language of the host countries, and actually we do recognize their skills. So again, what we're talking about is a proactive approach to regular migration that has to be, of course, engineered with basically the support of sending countries and receiving countries, and actually has to be coordinated at the global level. But the two main drivers, of course, is closing the gender gap and actually promoting the participation of all the workers. And when I mean closing the gender gap, we have to remind ourselves that actually women do work more than men. The problem is that they work more on unpaid work. So basically, increasing the employment rate in the formal labor market should not be at the expense of the fact that they work even more hours. So this also implies a rebalancing of basically working time between paid and unpaid work between men and women as well.
Right. So getting some gender balance back into our thinking to achieve prosperity. Stefano, now I know this is a trope that's often thrown out there, but your report does highlight that there are some pretty significant intergenerational frictions developing, certainly around wealth. And we're seeing older populations get richer, but the burden of achieving wealth for younger people has gotten harder. And I'm wondering just if you have some insights from this report about how we can increase fairness amongst generations, because even though there isn't this kind of friction in our day-to-day lives, there's clearly something underneath the surface that's brewing.
No, absolutely. I mean, let's go back for a second about these demographic changes. Another way to look at them is by considering what we call the dependency rate. So how many people 65 plus there are for those of working age? Today we are talking about 30%, right? On average in the OECD country, we might reach by 2060, 50%. This means that every person of working age in 2060 would have to sustain herself and basically contribute to the income, 50% of the income of someone on retirement. In countries like Japan or my own country in Italy, actually they have to provide for 70% of the income for someone on retirement. Just give you a sense of how potentially this demographic change will put a burden on the young generation that have basically to work for providing income for themselves or for a growing share of actually the income of those on retirement. The second point is that over the past decades in the OECD countries, we have seen income and to some extent wealth shifting from the young population that were much more skilled. They actually got better job than the old generation that have lower level of skills and tend to have lower paid jobs. And actually this income and wealth are shifted gradually towards the elderly, towards the older workers. This is also because our pension system mature and because many of the older workers enjoy much more stable jobs compared to many young people. So this, of course, requires policy across the board to make sure that the transition from school to work for young people is actually smooth, that we offer career opportunity for young people. But I think we have also to think seriously about the balance between capital and income taxes. And we have to think about also inheritance taxes, because the truth of the matter is that the risk of poverty today in many OECD countries is more concentrated on children and family with children than necessarily on people who are of older age. Now, don't get me wrong. If you look at the average wages and income of the younger generation, those in the 20s and 30s, it is still higher than those in the 60s, but the gap has actually narrowed dramatically and potentially will continue to narrow going forward.
And really, we're talking about stagnant wage growth effectively. Certainly, we've experienced that in the United States where it's beat inflation, but the cost of living for things like housing and education has gone up exponentially. What can these young people do, or how can they think about rebalancing policy in a way that might be more equitable across generations?
Well, I mean, young people do a lot because, of course, we have seen a tremendous improvement in the human capital and the skills of the young generation. I think they're much more mobile and willing to move and to be adaptable also in terms of working conditions. But it's true that productivity growth has been very slow growing in many OECD countries. So the other message in the employment outlook is that while we have to some extent, exploit all the talent we have been talking about, we also have to revamp productivity growth. That's the other key engine to actually make sure we can deal with demographic changes. And there is a great potential out there. There is a lot of speculation about, for example, the potential of artificial intelligence to basically revigorate, if you like, economic growth. And there is some early sign that this may indeed be the case. Now, what is needed there is, of course, to continue to invest in artificial intelligence to make sure it is actually used in actually across sectors. It's not just it's one of the general purpose technology that can actually benefit many sectors. Think about health. Think about the delivery of social programs. Think about the labor market. And of course, industrial processes and so on and so forth. We have to make sure, though, that artificial intelligence is used in what we say in a trustworthy way, because there are many potentials to boost productivity, but also a number of risks that actually workers see very well in terms of privacy, in terms of overpressure in the pace of work, and also to some extent them not being informed of the fact that this new technology is used. The other interesting point about artificial intelligence is that it can actually be an enabler to make the labor market more inclusive, including for all the workers. There are some very clear signals that some generative AI tool can actually make the labor market, the workplace, much more inclusive for people with disability, may actually allow workers to learn and to develop new skills and competences, even working from home and not necessarily in the workplace or in a classroom. So there are great potentials, but really we have to exploit all these potentials, also with in mind the fact that we might want to promote also the inclusivity on the way in which artificial intelligence actually will, to some extent, contribute to economic growth.
So I hear you saying that we could save some money in theory on the public side by leveraging artificial intelligence tools, but there might be some challenges that we may face on the private sector side, at least in terms of privacy and workforce protections. Does that encapsulate that?
Absolutely. We have run some surveys on that. And interesting enough, 4 in 5 workers in companies that actually use artificial intelligence told that actually this was beneficial for their performance. This is not surprising, of course. But actually it was beneficial also in terms of the job quality, because they can focus on the most interesting part of the job while leaving the most dangerous, sometimes more repetitive type of task to the artificial intelligence, to the algorithm. However, at the same time, they were concerned that artificial intelligence might increase the pace of their work, and also they were concerned about the privacy, or the fact that they might be being monitored in their performance in a very narrow way, in a very sophisticated way. So I think informing the workers about the fact that artificial intelligence is used, engaging with them, explain what decisions are taken using artificial intelligence, is a way to basically maximize the performance of the company on the one end, but actually the benefit for the workers as well. But I see huge potential in the use of artificial intelligence in sectors like health, the delivery of social services, and many other public services as well.
So I have to ask this question because I think it's like the elephant in the room. Has the OECD started to think about how states within its member countries might rethink revenue as a result of the adaptation or adoption of artificial intelligence if we're going to need fewer workers to do the jobs?
That's a very good question. I mean, at OECD, we have been working for more than 10 years of going beyond GDP, to some extent looking at the well-being from a multidimensional point of view. The important point you were mentioning is whether artificial intelligence will reduce the number of jobs we need because we'll substitute workers. I think it's early to say, but the evidence we have is that so far, artificial intelligence has not reduced employment. Actually, in the sector more exposed to the use of artificial intelligence, these are the sectors in which employment has increased more than in other sectors which actually use less artificial intelligence. I think the key issue here is whether we will be able to engineer significant skilling and upskilling for the workers to continue to be fully complementary to what the algorithms are and will be able to do. And I think this is a major challenge. I mean, going back to demographic changes, if you look at the exposure to training and retraining of workers, we're talking about 50% of the workers in the OECD on average participate in training. But if you look at all the workers, they should actually collapse to in between 20 and 30%. So to some extent, employer consider that if you are beyond 50, 55, well, the return on investment on your human capital is going to be lower because you're going to stay in the company for fewer years, while actually this might be the workers that need training more than younger workers who actually have the skills a little bit already developed also for the digital economy. So We really have to invest in the human capital for different reasons. One, to allow workers, including older workers, to stay longer into the labor market in a productive and effective way, but also to give them the opportunity to fully benefit from using artificial intelligence and remaining fully complementary with artificial intelligence.
Right. And we certainly know that young people have a pretty fast churn in the workforce today, 3 to 5 years within a job. So being able to extend the working life for a person who's advanced age might actually be a really good investment for a company. Stefano, I'd like to pivot back to the human side of things. You highlighted that there were a couple of different areas in which we could really pull together the human capital a bit better. You talked about older adults, you talked about migrants, you talked about women, and you talked about young people. Now, policymakers sometimes have to choose between which group they go after first. In your estimation, which one is the most pressing for governments to tackle today?
That's a difficult question to answer because I think my message would be we need all. We need also, from ethical reasons and from economic reasons, to make sure young people have a smooth transition from school to work. After all, this is the most educated generation entering the labor market. And yet we are not doing that. I mean, youth unemployment has declined, but it's still way too high for what it should be. Second, I think also for equitable and for economic reasons, we have to close the gender gap. We have made progress. But when we look at the gender pay gap, actually progress has not been as large as we would have wished. And I think a number of policies are in place. Where we can see also one of the largest potential impact to some extent address the demographic changes is, of course, by promoting the participation of all the workers. I think there, for very good reasons, obviously, we have been focusing a lot on the incentive side, on the worker side. So basically reforming the pension system. Now, this is, of course, essential because we have to maintain the financial sustainability of pension systems, but I think we have not focused enough on the employability of all the workers. So the condition whereby all the worker can remain productively into the workforce, into the workplace. And I think this is the area in which we have to focus more. Before I was mentioning the fact that all the workers participate in training much less. Sometimes you actually discover that they might not have the right skills when they're already old, right? And where the only option is to basically for them to leave the labor market. However, a number of countries are starting much earlier, in the 40s and early 50s, with a mid-career assessment of where workers stand, what are the potential in terms of career progression in the job they have, and whether by training and retraining themselves, they can actually stay on the job or actually move into other jobs. So I think we have to have this holistic approach, but I think the point is that we have to focus much more on preventive measure, not only with coping measures when some of the issues have already emerged, especially for all the workers.
Right. And we should note that the Kingdom of Denmark earlier this year increased their retirement age to 70. It's one of the highest in the world now. But if we only raise the retirement age, we're not really solving the challenges around bias and training within the workforce that might be lagging. I'm wondering about training now, because you've highlighted this a number of times throughout our conversation today. If participation falls so far and so steep after 50, what do you really think the incentive model should be for individuals and organizations to invest in that 50 plus capital, that worker capital that they have at their disposal? Or do you think if it's more a multi-way street where the individual and the organization both have to play an active role?
I think we have to work both with the employers, but also with the workers themselves. And I think a good public policy are absolutely needed. I think we have to fight ageism, this perception to some extent that after a certain age, workers by definition are less productive than younger workers. Actually, the evidence suggests that in the workplaces where the age balance is more even, actually these are places where the productivity is actually higher because you combine to some extent the experience of more senior workers with actually the skills, the digital skills of the younger generation. Actually, by letting them working together, you improve the overall performance of the company. The other, I think, is because when we look at the low participation of all the workers into training, this is because, again, the employer may feel that the return on that investment is lower, but actually some of the older workers might be reluctant to participate in training. They might think themselves that they have only a few years to go before going on retirement, and actually they might be afraid of going back to a standard classroom setting that they were there maybe 30 or more years ago. Now, the good news here is that artificial intelligence, again, can be a tool to change completely the way in which we design, we deliver training program. I think we can move into much more tailored training program, much shorter, actually even training program that can be delivered remotely, and actually those who deliver what we call the micro credentials. So many older workers may have left education with low level of formal qualifications, but maybe have 20, 25, even 30 years of work experience. These years of experience, so the skill they've learned through this experience, is actually not certified. So for them to move into a new job, they might not show basically what they've learned during this long career. So the micro-credential is also a way to recognize the skills that workers have acquired, not in the formal education period, but actually during the working life. So I would argue that artificial intelligence can be a tool to make training much more sort of tailored and useful, and actually improving also the human capital of the workers, and something that will cost also less, so be more attractive also for the employer themselves. The interesting point is that even if we look at the labor market today with the widespread labor shortage, many employers start realizing that they have to use the talent pool they have in their own company, because they have growing difficulties in finding the talent in the market by just recruiting new workers.
Right, Stefano, I've always appreciated your foresight and candor, and I'm wondering what you would tell a policymaker today. Certainly, they should read this report. They can get it from the show notes here at the OECD. But if there's one thing you'd want to tell them today, one message that you feel would land across the OECD countries, what's the most important thing, the single most important takeaway from this report?
Well, I think the message is that the demographic changes is somewhat what we call the forgotten megatrend. We focus a lot on digital and artificial intelligence. We focus a lot on climate change and climate mitigation policies. On the other hand, the demographic changes are there. And actually, among the three megatrends is the one more likely to actually occur, because it's very difficult to some extent to change in a significant way in a short period of time, basically demographic trends. On the other hand, the good message is that good policy can actually let us overcome the challenges of demographic change. But we have to act now. And I think this actually is a way to reconcile maintaining the growth in our living standards, but also making our labor market more inclusive, which is something we have been, to some extent, working on for many years. Is it time to act? Is now. And maybe the other corollary to that is that this perception that fertility, by promoting fertility, it's a way to basically address demographic changes. Well, of course, we can do the right policy, family policy, to allow couples to have as many children as they want, but it's not a panacea. It's not a silver bullet either. And actually, by allowing women to participate more in the labor market, we can make them actually more able to have the children they want, because we know that the relationship between participation in the labor market and actually the number of children women have is actually positive. It's not negative.
All right. One last question for you, if I can. We've known each other for over a decade now, and I'm wondering, given this period of time and all the change that we've seen, certainly around demographics in particular, and the shifting nature of the global economy, are you feeling more pessimistic or optimistic today about what's to come in the years ahead?
Well, I feel more optimistic of course, the challenges are massive, because we are perhaps unprecedentedly, we are living with three megatrends, again, digital, AI, climate change, and demographic, all at the same time. And of course, as we know very well, we're also exposed to a number of shocks, macroeconomic shocks. But if I think about from the global financial crisis to the COVID crisis, the cost of living crisis, I've seen significant improvement in the way in which you design and implement the policies. Labor market policies, social policies, skill policies. I think there is a lot to be done, but I think there is a growing understanding that this policy can really make a difference. So I'm fairly optimistic, but of course we need bold action, and we need actually some coordination also across country, which is very important also in this case.
Right. Stefano, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure seeing you and being with you today. And thank you for leaving us with a positive note.
Thank you very much. Great to be with you.
Our economy is being transformed regularly by shifting demographics, and it's not all good news. But as Stefano shared, there are things that we can do right here and right now to change it. These involve policy shifts, but also a shift in mindset. If you'd like to read more from Stefano's report at the OECD, please take a look at the show notes below. And as always, click subscribe and join us for more conversations about our demographic future. And of course, if you want to dive deeper, visit us at populationnext.com. That's populationnext.com. Thank you for joining us.